Thus far, we've considered the first cosmologists of what Nietzsche called Pre-Platonic philosophy. These figures consist, in the main, of Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus, and they all concern themselves with the question, what exists? What is the explanation for material existence? And they attempt to answer this question quite remarkably without recourse to mythological explanations. They do not produce cosmogonies, but cosmologies, attempts at representing the origins of matter and of living things, but without using magic or the will of a personified deity as the prime mover. Thales says that all being derives from water. All elements or individual things are transformations of water. Anaximander says that the original source of being cannot be something particular like water, which exists within that totality of being. In fact, it cannot be something that has any qualities at all, since all transitory, limited things are defined by qualities. Anaximander suggested something indefinite, something qualityless and prior to all the things that exist in their particularity, in this existence that is characterized by limitations and causes. Furthermore, he argued that the strife within existence is evidence that existence itself was at fault in some way, that individual things steal their existence from the indefinite, and this injustice is rectified when they eventually pass away and return to the indefinite. But a question is left in the wake of the notion of Anaximander, namely, why does becoming continue? Why do things continue to arise and pass away? Why hasn't all becoming been reabsorbed into the indefinite? Heraclitus arrives at this point in the dialogue. He rejects being entirely. He rejects the distinction between being and becoming. He suggests that all that exists is this arising and passing away. There is not some qualityless, indestructible state of being from which becoming quote-unquote emerges. Rather, the cosmos never began at all, and it will never end. Existence is governed by an eternal law of change, the logos, and to the extent that there is a nature or a character to existence, it is this very law. Existence for Heraclitus is innocent, and the strife which takes place within this world is therefore also innocent. It is not evidence of a fault to Heraclitus, it is simply the nature of existence, which quite blindly and innocently comes into conflicts. Life is a play of forces, an ever-living fire, strife is justice. But a question remains still, even after Heraclitus. He hasn't put to bed every metaphysical problem simply by rejecting this idea of static being. Perhaps the best way to put this question to ourselves is to consider something that I didn't really mention when we were talking about Heraclitus, but is an important element of Heraclitus's philosophy in light of the response to it. When we say that, quote-unquote, the world is eternal, to Heraclitus, we necessarily mean existence itself. But in Heraclitean philosophy, just as individual things are born, grow, flourish, and then grow old and die, Heraclitus believes that whole worlds are born, flourish, grow old, and die. In much the same way as the Hindus believe that over long kalpas, an entire cosmos comes into being and eventually is destroyed, well, then another cosmos arises in its place. Heraclitus thinks that this world will eventually be reclaimed by the ever-living fire, like all things are, but in the wake of this destruction, there's always a new world. The ever-living fire always returns in some new form. We cannot even say that the ever-living fire exists from the individual forms that it takes. The difference between Heraclitus and Anaximander is that Heraclitus doesn't think that reality returns to a sort of default state of the indefinite. Rather, it truly goes out of existence, like a flame that is snuffed out. Flame is used as an example by Heraclitus because of the very fact that it comes into being and passes away. It truly seems to vanish, leaving nothing behind. Notice what we have to take on, then, if we are to agree with Heraclitus on every last point. Unfortunately, we find ourselves at odds with modern science, for one, because Heraclitus would deny the conservation of matter and energy. He would say no, things really do get destroyed and then new things are born. Sure, we can say that it's all the same ever-living fire, but things really are snuffed out of existence and then new things are kindled anew. The real consequence of believing in arising and passing away is that it commits us to a metaphysical view that things go from non-existence to existence, and from existence to non-existence. The cyclical destruction of worlds is arising and passing away, but on the cosmic scale. This problem would be central for Parmenides. He is a contemporary of Heraclitus, and he takes exactly the opposite stance toward being. In so doing, he founds the Eleatic school of philosophy. Parmenides, circa 485 BC. Parmenides was from Elea, which was part of Magna Graecia, the Greek colonies in Italy. The school of philosophy known as the Eleatics takes its name from this city. For our purposes, Parmenides will serve as the sole representative of this school of thought. What we know of his philosophy comes to us from a very long poem entitled On Nature, written in hexameter. Originally, it ran to 800 lines, but now only around 150 lines of it remain. It's what we call Parmenides' fragments. Parmenides seems to have met Xenophanes, a rhetorician and poet whom Nietzsche thinks made a profound impact on Parmenides. And Parmenides would then go on to teach Zeno, the philosopher who is famous for giving us Zeno's paradox. As far as the character of Parmenides, it's said that he attempted to emulate the solemn and dignified bearing of religious figures, people such as the cult leader Pythagoras. While we can say that every such pre-Platonic concerned him with the question, what is? The most compelling thing about Parmenides is that he proceeds by asking the same question from the opposite direction. What isn't? He inquires about non-being. He attempts to figure out just what we're talking about when we refer to non-being. Non-being becomes a bit of a mystery to Parmenides. And yet we might note, non-being is key to the entire explanation of arising and passing away. It's therefore key to the entire Heraclitean understanding of becoming, in which things truly begin to exist and then cease to exist. That is becoming in a nutshell, and that is the strife, the change that Anaximander sees as evidence of life's faultiness. For Heraclitus, the strife is innocent, like the play of a child. For Anaximander, it's guilty. But in both cases, it is presumed that this arising and passing away really happens. Parmenides takes issue with just that notion. However, Parmenides, like many other philosophers, is a man with two eras to his thought. People speak of Wittgenstein I and Wittgenstein II, for example, the early and later Wittgenstein. Well, there's also a Parmenides I and Parmenides II. Both Parmenideses address themselves to this problem of non-being, but they handle it in two very different ways. And Nietzsche goes so far as to say that the difference between early Parmenides and later Parmenides is a sort of dividing line in pre-Platonic philosophy. Parmenides himself contains the end of one era and the beginning of another. Quote, Parmenides once had, probably in his later years, a moment of the very purest abstraction, undimmed by any reality, perfectly lifeless. This moment, un-Greek, like no other in the 2 centuries of the tragic age, the product of which is the doctrine of being, became a boundary stone for his whole life, which divided it into 2 periods. At the same time, however, the same moment divides the pre-Socratic thinking into 2 halves, of which the first might be called the Anaximandrian, the second the Parmenidean. The first period in Parmenides' own philosophizing bears still the signature of Anaximander. This period produced a detailed philosophic physical system as answer to Anaximander's questions. When later that icy abstraction horror caught him, and the simplest proposition treating of being and not being was advanced by him, then among the many older doctrines thrown by him upon the scrap heap was also his own system. End quote. So the early work of Parmenides is an answer to Anaximander. It's his Anaximandrian period, as Nietzsche calls it. His second period is what Parmenides is primarily known for. This is usually what people are referring to when they talk about the philosophy of Parmenides, and it's characterized by his pure theory of being. To see how he gets to this theory of pure being, it is worth examining his Anaximandrian period first. Anaximander causes a problem by posing us with dual and diverse worlds. There is the apparent world of becoming, and then the indefinite from which becoming snatches its existence. Heraclitus had resolved this division between appearance and reality, and his solution is to assert the reality of becoming and reject being. Parmenides approaches this from yet another perspective. His Anaximandrian period is characterized by a non-dualist project to establish becoming as something active and existent, which means to establish arising and passing away as something wholly active and existent. But this attempt of Parmenides results somewhat humorously in a proposed division of every phenomena into the category of either positive, existent, or negative, non-existent. A dualistic categorization scheme, we might say, in order to resolve dualism. The reasoning for why early Parmenides creates this set of categories is quite simple. If becoming is the primary reality, and this consists of arising and passing away, then that means that both coming into being and going out of being are real things, quote unquote. Non-being is therefore a real thing. And this is to say that certain phenomena that we experience are actually non-being or non-phenomena. We might say we're just experiencing the effect of non-existence. Certain phenomena are actually just passing away as it manifests itself within the becoming. Nietzsche writes, quote, Parmenides compared the qualities one with another and believed that they were not all of the same kind, but ought to be classified under two headings. If, for example, he compared bright and dark, then the second quality was obviously only the negation of the first, and thus he distinguished positive and negative qualities, seriously endeavoring to rediscover and register that fundamental antithesis in the whole realm of nature. Before his gaze, our empiric world divided itself into two separate spheres, into that of the positive qualities with a bright, fiery, warm, light, rare, active masculine character, and into that of the negative qualities. The latter express really only the lack, the absence of the others, the positive ones. He therefore described the sphere in which the positive qualities are absent as dark, earthy, cold, heavy, dense, and altogether as of a feminine passive character. Instead of the expressions positive and negative, he used the standing term existent and non-existent, and had arrived with this at the proposition that, in contradiction to Anaximander, this world contains something existent and of course something non-existent. One is not to seek that existent outside the world and as it were above our horizon, but before us and everywhere, in every becoming, something existent and active is contained. End quote. So that is Nietzsche's summary of Parmenides 1, and if you're familiar at all with the yin-yang idea or philosophy central to Chinese thought, you'll notice that Parmenides comes to many of the same categorizations, and he even associates the positive, the existent, with the active and masculine. This also includes the bright, the fiery, the warm, whereas the negative is feminine, dark, earthy, damp. These associations are all perfectly in line with yin and yang of Chinese philosophy. But the philosophy of Parmenides, too, is the philosophy for which he is so well known, as we've said. And the impetus for this shift in his thought seems to come almost as a divine revelation for Parmenides. He is struck with a profound idea, and his whole categorization schema for determining which phenomena are positive and which are negative, all of that is at this point smashed into dust. The revelation occurs when Parmenides poses a simple question. What is non-being? I'm going to read here from section 10, A Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, in an abridged form. Quote, There was a day upon which an odd idea suddenly occurred to Parmenides, an idea which seemed to take all value away from his former combinations, so that he felt inclined to throw them aside, like a money bag with old worn-out coins. On that day, he examined his two cooperating antitheses, the existent and the non-existent, the positive and the negative qualities, of which desire and hatred constitute the world and the becoming. He was suddenly caught up, mistrusting, by the idea of negative quality, of the non-existent. For can something which does not exist be a quality? Or to put the question in a broader sense, can anything indeed which does not exist, exist? The only form of knowledge in which we at once put unconditional trust, and the disapproval of which amounts to madness, is the tautology A equals A. But this very tautological knowledge called inexorably to him. What does not exist, exists not. What is. Suddenly, he feels upon his life the load of an enormous logical sin. For had he not always, without hesitation, assumed that there were existing negative qualities, in short, a non-existent, that therefore, to express it by a formula, A equals not A, which indeed could only be advanced by the most out-and-out perversity of thinking. It is true, as he recollected, the whole great mass of men judge with the same perversity. He himself has only participated in the general crime against logic. But the same moment which charges him with this crime surrounds him with the light of the glory of an invention. He has found, apart from all human illusion, a principle, the key to the world secret. He now descends into the abyss of things, guided by the firm and fearful hand of the tautological truth as to being. End quote. It's worth noting several things about this single powerful thought of Parmenides, that the non-existent doesn't exist, and only what is exists. For one, even though I described it as akin to the religious experience, like the other Pre-Platonics, Parmenides snatches this revelation from the ether with purely the faculty of his own reasoning. It's a kind of iron logical commandment that Parmenides perceives. And Nietzsche says that this grasping of this abstract truth is a wondrous abstraction, but simultaneously it is a descent into the abyss. And Nietzsche describes Parmenides numerous times as spider-like, weaving a web with his logic. And unlike the fire and water that we find in the spirit of the earlier cosmologists, people like Heraclitus and Thales, these thinkers who entangled themselves with the movement and the material of the phenomenal world, Nietzsche says that the feeling one gets from the philosophy of Parmenides is that it is frozen. Nietzsche says that he, quote, dives into the cold bath of his icy abstractions, end quote. If non-being doesn't exist, then change and transformation do not exist either, which means they must be illusions. Motion, a great metaphysical riddle, therefore doesn't exist either, because this presupposes that bodies could move through negative space, that there could be pockets of non-being within which beings could move. But such pockets of non-being can't possibly exist. Furthermore, time is also such an illusion. This would also preclude the existence of motion. The reason why time is an illusion is because what is what is now, not what was or what will be. Those are just other ways of describing something that does not exist. Nietzsche describes Eleatic thought as a view of being bound in logical chains. The result of their ideas is that the world is rendered static, innate, and dead. The Parmenidean view of reality ultimately is that it is an unmoving, eternal, spherical form. That is what Parmenides says the world is, a definite existent thing which always is and does not change. It does not exist within time. Our perceptions of motion and change are nothing more than the delusions of the people who trust in their senses. Parmenides says, quote, do not follow the dim-sighted eyes, nor the resounding ear, nor the tongue, but examine only by the power of thought. End quote. Nietzsche says that the power of Parmenides' will for certainty is something admirable, but that ultimately the Eleatic philosophy is a false path. Parmenides ceases to be a natural philosopher at all, and on this point, Nietzsche agrees with the likes of Aristotle. The interest in the natural world ceases with Parmenides. The direction of thought turns entirely to the abstract laws which we impose on reality, due to what Nietzsche would later write is a grammatical faith. In Parmenides, we can see a figure who had a profound influence on Plato in this respect. The philosopher is he who does not trust the senses, and the fact that any man who trusts his senses comes to a number of what we call common sense conclusions about reality is not an argument in favor of those common sense conclusions. The great many are deluded. Wisdom is the purview of a select few. That much is obvious to the likes of Parmenides. And thus, by rejecting the senses and seeking certainty in abstract thought, Parmenides provides yet another piece of the Platonic philosophy that will later come into being. That being said, Nietzsche thinks that the later Parmenides offers us a philosophy, quote, void of content, end quote. It is clear where Nietzsche stands, given what he would write in Twilight of Idols. He sides eternally with Heraclitus, who rejected being and upheld only becoming, and so he rejects Parmenides, who denied becoming and upheld only being. Nietzsche rejects this because becoming is the given reality. This is what is given to us by our experience of the world. While Nietzsche certainly might have been sympathetic to arguments that we should not simply go along with the common sense wisdom, he believes that this journey into the world of abstractions is a sort of prefiguration of the ascetic's otherworldly attitude. A pure theory of being inevitably becomes a type of philosophy that Nietzsche would call bloodless. He says that Parmenides doesn't even hint at the kind of Buddhistic salvation from becoming that one might find in Schopenhauer or in his pre-Platonic precursor, Anaximander. There is none of the Indian breeze that Nietzsche detects in the work of Anaximander. He says that Parmenidean thought is, quote, the very absence of fragrance, color, soul, form, the total lack of blood, religiosity, and ethical warmth, the abstract schematic, in a Greek, end quote. In his own way, however, Parmenides' way of inquiring after the nature of reality for all its problems opens the way for the next class of thinkers among the Pre-Platonics. Nietzsche explains this in his Pre-Platonic lectures, quote, through him specifically, the problem of becoming came into philosophy, not through the Eleatics. That they deny it is the shortest way out, yet the least illuminating. With this ceases all observation of nature, all desire to learn from things. Then the fundamental failure remains, that the apparatus of the senses is inexplicable. It moves itself. It is in plurality. If it itself is a delusion, how can it be the final cause of a second delusion? The senses deceive, but what if the senses did not exist? How could they deceive? So plurality and motion of the senses certainly exist, and so everything else may be moved and manifold. End quote. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimelyreflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.